Pause for just a second more. We come to the 21st presentation in this year-long series. And like all presentations for the last 30-some years, I've divided this year into quarters. When I began devising courses at San Francisco State in 1966, my first course, we were on the semester system, but the quarter system was coming into play. So I did a end run around. I had a quarter system, but 2 quarters that meshed together so that you could have more than 10 weeks, but not quite the full 13 weeks. So I'm used to that kind of a structure. Even though it's a quarter, the quarters overlap in such a way that you could really put it together as a trimester year, which is an ancient technique, by the way. We're looking at the tidal wave that is hitting our civilization as we speak, and as we have been speaking, myself for almost 50 years on the university level. But the presages for us go back quite a ways. They go back, in fact, to the middle of the 17th century, back to about the 1650s, where for that time, a kind of a trigger was pulled on the way in which language is used by civilization. It took a while for those who were born in the 1640s, maturing in the 1650s, and coming to their adulthood in the 1660s and onward, to be able to have the education, the background, the experience to begin their work. And it took about 10 to 15 years for that to come out. And in fact, in the 1680s, one found all of a sudden an enormous jump in the comprehension of the use of language. And it came in the form of mathematics. In 1687, when Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica in Latin, it was understood by just a handful of people at the time who had the patience, the intellect, and the insight to be able to wade through it. And it took a while, and it took Newton a while, to reread and constantly rewrite and bring out. And by the time of the 3rd edition of Principia Mathematica, he was already into the 1700s, almost into the 1720s, and had given up mathematics as his sole concern and profession. He held the Lucasian chair of mathematics at Cambridge University. But by that time, in his older age, born in 1642, he was the master of the mint of England. That is to say, he controlled the design of the structure of the economy of the British Empire, which was based on the money, the pound. And it was Newton's great genius that he was able to set up what eventually became known later on, because of the structure of it, that it was a political economy. And the surge of the power of the British Empire is due to the incredible intelligence of Newton. And the Principia Mathematica in the third edition began to be clear enough in its improved and revised language to get across that he was working with calculus as a new scalar in the way in which mankind could express the infinitesimal and the infinite. That there is a way to have an integral moving from zero to oneness with an infinite number of steps involved. That one could have a mathematical analytic of any degree of specificity and exactness, and one could track it and be able to not only track what it was that you were after, but the entire movement of how the mathematics got to where it got and what was the scalar with which it was working. And the same thing could be done in reverse of going from 1 to 0, this kind of a differential calculus, and one could get back to the zero quality of nature with its pristineness without any kind of occurrence in between. And this was a monumental development. At the very same time, G.W. Leibniz in Germany was developing the calculus as well on a parallel course. And very often in civilization, there are parallels. There are tunable persons, not just individuals, but persons. And sometimes 3, sometimes more. Sometimes they're pairs of pairs. But that tunability is consistent. And Leibniz's language was superior to Newton's language. What Newton characterized as fluxions became in Leibniz's calculus the differential and the integral calculus that we use his terminology today, though we use Newton's whole understanding of calculus, of mathematics, as a springboard that eventually, when there was a generation of persons who could understand Newton really completely, there was a revolution in mathematics. And as we've talked about, the first great translation of Newton into a modern language, out of the Latin, into a modern language was into French. And it was Madame du Châtelet, the longtime friend of Voltaire, lover of Voltaire. And while she was working on translating Newton's Principia into French, Voltaire was using his genius to help her to understand the incredible creative genius of the way in which calculus, with its differential and its integral pairing, was extraordinary. And his cue was Leibniz, not Newton. And in fact, Voltaire wrote a classic short novel. It's still in print. It's been in print since it was published. It's called Candide. Candide is a protagonist who is very innocent in a world of dangers and ignorance and miscalculations and so forth. And he survives going through this kind of a world in search of the best of all possible worlds. And Candide is based on Leibniz, because Leibniz's calculus came from understanding not the Western mathematical precedents. Newton learned from Isaac Barrow, who was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge before him. The whole history of development of mathematics, and really was genius and understood. But Leibniz learned from the most strange source of all, from a Jesuit Latin translation of the Chinese I Ching. And he learned that the yin-yang of the Tao Te works both ways. It can be infinitesimally exact. It can be infinitely expansive in its exactness as well. And so with Voltaire and Madame de Châtelet, you had for the first time a generation of French mathematicians who read like a who's who of the way in which new kinds of mathematics were being done. Fourier, Lagrange, etc., etc. You could name several dozen who sprung mathematics from its classical Greek origins into what that reference wave of 1650 triggered, that mathematics now was a new kind of expressiveness in language. And if one could learn to read and write equations, you could go almost anywhere, and we have. The difficulty is that to read equations out loud is not intelligible. You have to have a blackboard to write them so that someone can read them. This is one of the pitfalls of the way in which the limitations of calculus, of mathematics, has constantly been broached for someone to try to express it differently. And in French, in the French language, 100 years after Voltaire and Madame de Châtelet, in that next generation that began after Fourier and Lagrange and all of the French mathematicians and genius, you had a revolution in poetry in France. And the first great poet of the new French language was Baudelaire. And Baudelaire instantly had those who began to understand. A young semi-waif named Rimbaud at 19 was writing a great book, Flowers of Evil, in poetry of the new French. And his older friend, Paul Verlaine, absolutely entranced with what the young man was able to discourse with him. And so with Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Verlaine, and then the great genius of Mallarmé, whose poetic was so startling because it was very close to Monet's Impressionism. And one had Monet, one had Renoir, one had all of the Impressionists, one had the French symbolists, and all of a sudden you had a whole revolution in the way in which art caught up with mathematics, and it was recognized that mathematics was really an art, not a science yet, but an art, moving towards a science. If one could have an intermediate step, an intermediate stage that was comprehensive, that not only made sense, but had a new calibration of what sense is. And that intermediate step between art and science is history. Not history as a subject. The best way to phrase it is to take a word from calculus. It is a phase. It is a phase in a scalar, in a spectrum of a development where a phase of matter would be that it is a gas. Another phase of matter is that it is a solid. When you have an intermediate phase between a gas and a solid, that there is a liquid, now you've got something that you can compose with. But if you add a fourth, which was added in the 20th century, about 2 decades into it, the term began, of course, with an insight of a Frenchman. We've talked about de Broglie, and he understood that there is such a thing as a pilot wave that does not decay, that does not expand, but maintains its continuity. Its energy quotient carries continuously. And along with de Broglie, one had the French poetic philosopher Henri Bergson say, the key then is time, but that time is not a clock, it's not a calendar, it's not a calibration, it's a duration. It in fact is a creative duration, and one of the first of Henri Bergson's great world-shattering books. The English translation is Creative Evolution. One has to have the transform mind. You have to have, as Wallace Stevens once in one of his poems, he said, you have to have a mind of summer to be able to understand poetry. You have to become unthawed from the way that you were all the time, not knowing that it was all the time, to slip out of that time, to slip out of that kind of time into a continuity that is creative and memorable, braided together. And history does that as a phase between art and science as phases, and where they occur in that, not so much a sequence, but in that spectrum, they occur in a field of vision. And it's that ecology of a field of vision from which art emerges, begging to be heard invisibly by science, so that the science and the art would tune together. They needed to have, in that differential conscious field, a kaleidoscopic conscious scalar that made the phases all together as an ecology. And once the artists and the scientists were historically begun to be understood together, not together as an integral, but initially as a differentiation, as a differential, with the field of vision, now called, the first person to call it this was William James, who was a very close friend of Henri Bergson. He called it a stream of consciousness. There is a stream of consciousness that is the flow. In fact, it's not a flow like a liquid, but it is a flow like a very complex, more primordial liquid. And out of that, in the early 20th century, came a fourth phase of matter, the plasma. The plasma is like a stream of consciousness. But as soon as one becomes sophisticated enough to understand that this field of vision is a field, it's a field of differential consciousness, not a stream. History is the stream, but it's not just a stream. It's a great complex river system that has an enormous delta that develops out of this. And it has an enormous range of sources in the highlands, in the snowpack or the rainfall, And all those rivulets, all those streams coming down to this great river that flows through this massive, differential, historical, kaleidoscopic, conscious history delta into the ocean of the cosmos. All of this happened almost in a peculiar, surreal fashion in the 20th century. Happened so covertly, so esoterically, so geniusly, so artistically, so scientifically, so historically but not really understood, that we have come into the 21st century beleaguered by a gift of possibility and no way to utilize any of it. Because that reference wave, like a trigger starting this cascade of the mathematization of language, finally, like the French system of the decimal to the nth degree is digital. And as soon as you move to that nth degree of digital, and you can put it into a technology which is the historical link in vision that leads to science. Now, by 2014, by May, late May of 2014, you have what used to be called a phantasmagoria. Everyone is chaotically dazzled by what they see, hear, taste, feel, etc., dream, etc., and don't understand at all, because they have no way to understand at all. One of the figures who dealt with this in the 20th century was Carl Jung. And the most difficult of Carl Jung's books to read is Answer to Job. Antwoord Job. When it was first published in the works of Carl Jung, published by the Bollingen series, the Bollingen Foundation, it was in a book that they were doing called Psychology and Religion, West and East. I remember buying a copy of it at the University of Wisconsin in the university's bookstore in the basement of the student union. And in those days, paperbacks were all by publisher, all the Penguin books together, the Anchor books, the Harper Torch books, and so forth. And with the Meridian books, along with Philosophies of India by Heinrich Zimmer, one had Psychology, East and West. And it was so popular because it was really difficult that a single paperback edition, what finally was published of Answer to Job. Now, of course, one can find the single copy published by Princeton, which took over the Bollingen series some long while ago. And it's still in print. Everything's in print. And Jung says, it was very difficult for me to even come to writing Answer to Job, because even though I have been a psychologist, a psychiatrist on the world-class level for as long as many people have been alive, I could not understand why it bothered me so much that I could not understand the book of Job. And the fever broke out when he was trying to write a book that was so complex. The first volume of the three was called Aeon, A-I-O-N. And when Aeon was published in its original German, the three-volume edition, it was the frontispiece of a photograph of a Gnostic figure wrapped with a serpent and a lion-like face. And right away, people wrote this off as being weird and strange. What in the world is an aeon anyway? Well, it's a time period of enormous lengths in terms of ordinary time, but of even more enormous meaning in terms of eternal timelessness. The second part of that three-volume set was archetypes of the collective unconscious. One of Jung's famous phrases was to somebody asking him, how can I understand archetypes? And his reply was, you don't have archetypes, they have you. And the third volume, in the German edition, had this quality that was elusive, and so he put it with other works, like Mysterium Coniunctionis, the alchemical coming together of the two, not into one, but the two becoming a third, which then makes a hermetic thrice greatestness. That third can be a child, but it can also, with perfect tuning, be a presence, which is eternal. When the Bollingen series was putting out the collected works of Jung, they could not put that third volume that was related to Mysterium Coniunctionis, that was related to Aeon and archetypes of the collective unconscious. They refused, because of all kinds of criticism and carping and anger, frustration, and so forth, to put it into the collected works of Jung in the same black volumes with the gold and copper design on it. So they published it separately in a red cover with no design, not part of the collected works. And, well, it's edited by Marie-Louise von Franz from a manuscript that Carl Jung wrote who knows when and under what conditions. And she's the one who's presenting this, and it's called Aurora Consurgens, which is Jung's psychological, not commentary, but opening, continuing to open until it was opened into the field of differential consciousness itself. And it was based on a fulcrum, a pivot, a trigger of a secret last short book manuscript by the dying Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, who is the patron intellectual structure of the Roman Catholic Church. It was on alchemy. And it was written not for everyone, it was written only for one person. It was written for Thomas Aquinas' teacher. In English, his name is Albert the Great. Albertus Magnus in Latin. And it's Albertus Magnus who understood enormously that Aquinas had this incredible exactness of not mentality, but incisive mind, that he could go into the details as with as much filigree as was necessary. It's often said in the world of very large scholarship that Thomas Aquinas had the kind of mind that in India you would find with Shankaracharya, who was the developer of Vedanta. Out of the Vedas and out of all of the Indian yoga, he made Vedanta. And his commentaries on Indian things, India, are infinitesimally detailed. The great Indian physicist who was much like Shankaracharya, like Thomas Aquinas, was Chandrasekhar, who is one of the greatest mathematical minds of all time, who was the one who figured out the math of event horizons, of what became black holes, etc., back in the 30s. When Jung came to write the book of Job, he was stewing in aeon, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the mysterium conjunctionis, the aurora consurgens. How does this whole alchemy, how does this incredible detail, how does it play out in not just the psychology, not just in the psychiatry, not in just the psyche, but the field within which the psyche has transformation. The psyche is psyche in the world, in the natural cycle, but the natural cycle, which can go around and around like a circle, can also be subject to a magnetic skew, and not just a magnetic skew, but a magnetic pair of skews, introducing a chirality into the rotation so that the circle becomes a spiral in time. And in fact, it becomes a double spiral in time, because it can spiral very, very, very small. It can spiral very, very, very expansive. So it's a double helix. Beginning to understand? Beginning to get it? All of this happened in the middle of the 20th century. And the cue was that Jung learned again and again that if you stayed in the West, in the Western tradition, you would never be able to emerge from it enough, long enough, deep enough, high enough, small enough, large enough to be able to begin to understand. So that by working with a psyche east and west, now you had a pair that would not only have the symmetry of an integral, but it would have the double chiral of a differential. So that one, now by the 1960s, when there began to be a population of my peers understanding, we can understand the East faster than the Easterners can. They can understand the West faster than we can. But we get the East faster than, because they no longer had the natural, almost naive openness to not just receive it, but to participate with it. They not only received the Western tradition, they participated with it. And more of the great scientists and engineers and mathematicians are Asians. India, China, Korea, Japan, etc., etc. And more of the savants and sages of the Eastern tradition are Westerners who really do understand, who really do participate. We're going to take a little break, but this is just an introduction to WET, that this year is the Parayana, which is a double transform of what was the great accomplishment in the East that got transformed about 2,000 years ago by a new aeon then, and is now being distilled into its double second transform, and that this double second transform is the distillation of kaleidoscopic history becoming understandable, where the arts and sciences are able to participate together in what long ago was called the ideal of a Renaissance. Universities that are universal because they teach cosmically by participation. Let's take a break.